Turning to the 2001 AUMF, my colleague from Kentucky, and please correct me if I get this wrong, but noted that most rational people looking at the 2001 AUMF would not see a connection to the uses in which it's being employed today. Did I get that right? And I have it here in my hand, and earlier, Secretary Tillerson, you noted that you weren't sure of the motivations behind that AUMF, but it's so clearly laid out in the whereases of that AUMF, and it is very specifically targeted to use all necessary and appropriate force against nations, organizations, or persons planning or authorized or committed or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred or harbored such organizations or persons. Completely about those 2001 attacks. The thing that I think all we're struggling with as a committee and our role in this constitutional balance is between a situation, a vision of the past in which our Constitution was framed around a declaration of war and then an executive who commanded forces in such wars, and the modern battlefield of the world in which there are terrorist groups scattered about, and whether what you're asking for, which sounds like permanent worldwide ability for the executive on its own to take on radical Islam. And that is quite a different vision than the one laid out in our Constitution. Am I describing it fairly in terms of, because I did hear no timeline, no geographic constraints, no restriction on type of operations. That sounds a whole lot like a permanent transition of power to the executive that really takes Congress out of the picture once that such an AUMF would
Senator, that statement from the authorization goes on to say, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. And I think you bring up a very valid point, because the Westphalian world that the Constitution was written in obviously has been thrown aside by these very powerful transnational groups that we see right now. And so however we deal with this to keep Congress's legitimate, strong constitutional power in play has got to recognize that traditional forms of warfare are no longer used. There are ways to do this. There's many variations that have been offered for AUMFs that could address this or in some ways will not address it. But I think we do have to recognize that Congress was very blunt that it was to prevent future acts of terrorism.
Yes, and it sure was, by such nations and organizations that had been involved in planning, authorizing, and assisting the terrorist attacks on September 11th. But often I hear, and I think we've heard it a number of times today, that this has been reinterpreted to involve any associated forces. Now, there is no wording in this of associated forces. And it's often, I find in just academic discussions, people think that those words exist in here. Now, I do understand that the point that organizations change names and fracture and move on. But we are quite distant in purpose and time from these groups which attacked us on 2001. And the challenge here is, what if one takes this associated forces as an add-on to this, an implication of this, then the question becomes, isn't almost anything associated in the world? And where is that line? And that's a challenge for this committee and in dialogue with the executive to figure out what is that line. And that's what we're struggling with. And I, for one, am not ready to concede that the line should be wiped out with no geographic limits, no time limits, no style of force limits.
Thank you very much.